Right now, there is an abundance in the video world. There's too much video being created, there's too much video being shown online, and there's too much video being delivered in an environment which obviously was not designed for video. From the minute someone picks up a camera to the endpoint where a viewer is sitting down to enjoy the content, there are a number of places where video AI can really help deliver both better content, a more cost-effective environment, and knowledge and really innovation that you wouldn't otherwise have been able to get. If you're looking at delivering video at scale, video AI is going to be really the only way you're going to be able to do this in the future. So today, there are AI products that include content generation, metadata creation, search and discovery, compression, and a lot of other areas. We have a wide range of experts on the panel here. I'm going to let them introduce themselves, and then we're going to talk a little bit about the uses that they have in their organizations. We're also going to talk about some best practices that they recommend. And later, we have a number, I've asked them to all think about different ways to talk to you guys about how you can start to use more AI in your workflow. And so before the questions, they will actually touch on this, and then we're obviously going to leave room for questions. If we don't get to your question, please make sure you reach out, and we will get you an answer. So I'll first start off with letting the panelists introduce themselves, starting with Matt here.
Hi everybody, my name is Matthieu Lorrain. I've been at Google for 10 years and I'm based in New York City. I'm the head of creative innovation in a team called The Zoo. And The Zoo is a creative think tank at Google working with big brands and agencies. So we do a lot of work touching any kind of technologies, including AI and cloud. In my case, actually, my specialty is also augmented reality.
I'm David Clevinger. I am Senior Director for Product Strategy and Product Management for IBM's Watson Media business unit. Our focus is really on taking Watson's visual algorithms and applying them to video in a variety of ways. Everything from optimizing workflows to metadata generation to stream optimization. Lately, we've been focusing a lot on sports and esports. As you know, IBM is very actively involved in the Masters and US Open and other sporting events, but those use cases extrapolate pretty quickly into other industries, and that's my job, to help bridge that gap.
Hi, my name is Jason Hofmann. I'm with Limelight Networks, the content delivery network. I've been with the company about 9 years, formerly head of product management. Currently, for the last few years, head of CDN architecture and technology. And my focus for the last 3 or 4 years has been to transform Limelight into a quality leader that's also very, very efficient. So driving top line through better video performance for our customers as more and more customers select CDNs either manually or automatically based on stats like rebuffers, as well as also improving the bottom line through making our service significantly more efficient. And one of the ways we achieve that is through machine learning, which we'll talk about today.
Morning, everyone. My name is Josh Gray. I'm a principal architect at Citrix. Just prior to that, about 2-3 months ago, I was chief architect at Citrix. We were acquired by Citrix. And we operate the largest community internet performance metrics data set in the world that collects over 10 billion rows of data every single day from all over the planet, virtually every originating ISP, ASN to virtually every public delivery of infrastructure. Bit delivery. We use AI and AI techniques largely because we're trying to turn tens of billions of data points into meaningful signals that we can feed back and use to actively manage the delivery of video and other content. And we'll talk more about that, how we get into that in a minute.
And I'm Cullen Gallagher. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Really. We're a company out of Southern California that uses computer vision and deep learning to automatically identify, clip, tag, and distribute sports highlights in real time. Like I said, we use AI every single day in everything that we do, from the ground up, and just kind of playing in some of the same areas that these people are, but with a more productized version as opposed to something that's more consulting driven or case by case driven. So that's us.
So in the audience, how many people here have a good idea as to what video AI is? Can you raise your hand? Okay, good. I will just briefly touch on it just for anyone who's not as familiar with it. So with video, there is an awful lot of unstructured data. Video AI gives you the ability to actually go and look into that video and to find material that you wouldn't otherwise been able to find. So with AI uses data to learn, predict, and deliver an outcome based on learning that occurs through the data. So if you want a system to understand cats, you take a lot of cats, you train it on the cats, and then eventually it will know what a cat looks like. That's a very basic definition, but it's essentially the same thing. And these guys now are going to talk about something a little bit more sophisticated than cats. But what I asked them to talk to on the first question was, what is a typical use case that you have in your organization for AI, and what's it doing for you? So we can start with whoever chooses to jump in first. Which one of you?
Identifying cat videos.
Identifying cat videos. Actually, okay, so.
That's where everybody starts.
The man from
Once you
IBM.
master that.
Okay.
Yeah, exactly.
David. You wanna-
Sure. I think the typical use case that we've been seeing is media entities that have large back catalogs of content that was originally created when they didn't have complex metadata tool sets, didn't have necessarily the right people applying metadata, didn't think of all the use cases on the output side, maybe it's historical content. A very concrete example is work that we've done for the US Open. We actually took hundreds of thousands of video clips and photos and news articles and vocabulary terms and proper names and fed it to Watson and helped Watson understand what tennis was about so that it could do things like when you heard the word Ashe, it was capital A-S-H-E, Arthur Ashe, as opposed to lowercase a-s-h. So there was a lot of training around that. The output then became our ability to create clips based on what was happening within an event, but also to describe historical video as well. That's critical for companies with large media back catalogs who then need to optimize that moving forward. You can apply it to live, of course, but that's a typical use case that we see.
So you were taking the video, you were going through it in real time,
Yeah.
you were figuring out what content was in the video.
It's a recursive learning system. So we took a cross-section of a set of video assets, described it to Watson, said this is what's going on, this is who this player is, this is what is being said. It then we were able to turn it loose really on other unstructured assets, have it say what it thought it was finding, and then we were able to correct it.
Okay.
So we were able to basically, train it up to understand tennis specifically.
Okay.
And then the output was we could then turn it loose on a bunch of different kinds of outputs for the client. That was the idea.
And the outputs are?
Closed captioning, video clips, excitement scoring. I know you've got a video here that talks about the Masters and some work we've done there, but we were able to do things like listen for crowd noise and then say, this must be really exciting because the crowd is making a lot of noise at this moment. So we were able to turn that into an excitement score. So,
Okay.
But we wouldn't be able to do that if we didn't really help the algorithm understand what it was looking at and how it should be thinking about that body of work.
So you were training the algorithm to get smarter and smarter, and then you let it go?
Exactly. And then we just turn it loose and let it go.
Okay.
And that's the idea, is to get it to the point where you can just turn it loose and let it run and then move on to the next one.
Okay, all right. Who else would like to talk about their use case?
I'll take a shot. So we deal kind of underneath the actual video delivery itself and deal with more of the experience metrics of how the video is getting there, how the playback is occurring. And it's a similar kind of pattern, and I wanted to underscore that a lot of the good use cases for AI that we've seen are where you you have to meaningfully interpret metrics that are fuzzy and noisy in nature. And so the classic examples of like OCR handwriting, if you think about that, everybody's handwriting is a little bit different. But virtually any place where you're taking large volumes of metrics out of the real world and doing something meaningful with them, there's incredible noise and variation, and that's a great application of where you can train systems to extract the meaningful patterns that underlie the noise and variation. And in our case, we do it a lot with playback metrics and with delivery metrics and performance metrics all around the world to be able to get the clean signals that tell us how we should change the systems to meaningfully improve video content delivery.
Yeah, and for us, it's very similar to what Dave was talking about with what IBM's doing. However, we're looking at a different segment of the market. So they're looking to maximize the content at the highest levels of sports, whereas our ultimate goal is to be able to make sports highlights and things like that cost effective at the lowest levels, so that if you're a soccer mom and you're uploading a video of your child's soccer game, you should also be able to automatically get highlights from that. And it relates a lot to what you were saying, is that it becomes noisier and noisier data, so that when you're setting up your algorithms and when you're setting up your neural networks, you have to account for that and make sure that you're able to still glean important pieces of data even out of somewhat noisy data sets.
Okay, I'm going to ask you what a neural network is, since you used the word.
Yeah, I mean, look, neural network, everyone here has probably heard the term neural network, correct? Yeah, it's just basically a software algorithm that you can use to sort of train a computer to learn, as opposed to hard coding everything.
Okay.
So that's probably the lowest level way of talking about it.
Excellent, excellent, okay. Anybody else?
I mean, I can talk about, in my case, we're using AI for more like creative uses, but it has a lot to do with like how you can control video and create interactive video experiences. We use AI to recognize facial, emotions or voice, So, for example, we have created prototypes where you could control video experiences with your voice. We have good use cases, for example, for like recipes. When you're cooking, usually your hands are busy, so you may want to be able to move forward, like pause a video just by talking to it. We also use like gesture interaction. So, for example, we have created an experience for Nissan where you were able to control their whole website, just with hand gestures. It was a partnership with Star Wars, so obviously you wanted to be a Jedi, and Jedi can control video with their hand gestures. Of course, right? So the idea is like, how can you really change the way you consume video by making it much more interactive? And I think facial expression also is an interesting input. So to give you a few examples, we have, for example, built prototypes where we could bookmark when people are laughing, which is a way then to identify indeed the funniest moment in the video, which reminds me what you said about the excitement of the crowd, except that in that case, it was like on the front end. That's something we show to people. So many ways to use AI here to make the content a little more interactive and to be able to change actually the storyline in your content based on how people react to it.
Yeah, our use case at Limelight is completely different from everything we just heard, which is more about the content. At Limelight, our use case is more about the delivery of the content, because generally speaking, if we changed our customers' content, they wouldn't be very happy with that. So we tend to get out of that business and optimize the delivery of that content for various things, for quality, as well as also to ensure efficiency and scale. To keep up with the price compression in the CDN industry, you need to get 20-30% more efficient every year just to keep your head above water. And so it's an engineering challenge. And if you think about it, every piece of content is a little different from a cost profile to deliver. It's why when you look at CDNs that let you sign up for services, self-service, there's always a GB fee and a request fee, because those things have fixed costs. And a tiny object costs a lot more to deliver than a bigger object, and if you charge GB for everything, you're going to lose money. So we needed to model that, and we spent a number of years modeling that by hand and saying, well, based on our experiments on a typical server in a lab, a request takes about the same amount of CPU to process as delivering 32 KB worth of data. So we'll just use that as a fudge factor to estimate. But it turns out that in the real world, every server is different. You could have a server with hyperthreading turned off because it's on a legacy CPU that maybe had issues with it. You could have a server in a highly regulated data center in France where you get a noise complaint. You need to slow the fan speed down, so you need to turn off turbo on the processors. You could have a server that is very powerful, but because you are now doing a lot more out of that server than you did when you bought it because of the software engineering gains you've gotten over the years, that server only has dual 10 gig NICs, but it's capable of pushing more than 18. Now the NIC is the bottleneck. So you you can see that the problem space expands. There is no such thing as a typical server anymore. In a company with tens or hundreds of thousands of servers, every server might have a different breaking point and might have a different sweet spot. So if you're trying to target the best possible quality, you don't want to push a server to its breaking point. And so to figure out every server's sweet spot, what's the old way of doing it? Get every permutation of every kind of server and put it in a perf lab and load test it. Well, then you're missing another element of the equation, which is that at peak hours in London, we might be doing more Sky, Sports, and home.pt.com website images, but at peak hours in New York, we might be doing a lot more Prime Video than anything else. And now, that's a different traffic mix. The server is going to behave very differently. One server might hit its breaking point or its peak operating point at 38 gigabits per second, and in another market, it might hit it at 22 because it's dealing with smaller objects and non-cacheable objects and more complex rules at the edge. So we applied machine learning to sort of figure out every server's sweet spot. And hopefully I'll get to talk a little bit more about it later, but not just in the moment, but 2 weeks in advance. Because if you make decisions in the moment and reroute traffic to another server, all of a sudden that server is a cache miss and you're disruptive. So the idea is to figure things out in advance, because traditional load balancing techniques of when a server hits a high watermark, drain traffic and put on another, don't work very well in a caching context, because anytime you drain traffic away from server A to server B, you're now exposing server B to new content it's never seen before, and you're putting load on the customer's origin. So ideally, you want to never let server A go past its sweet spot, and you want to try to make that decision days or weeks in advance. And that's how and when we started using machine learning.
Okay, now you're all in fairly different parts of the ecosphere, but one of the things that strikes me that each person has talked about is how the machine learning works. Now, you've got the technical side of it, but you also have the business side. So why should businesses care about this? So Colin, you mentioned that you're giving people the ability to actually go and find things. Can you talk about a little bit about why someone should care from the business side?
Yeah, definitely. And we've talked about it up here. If your company doesn't have an AI or machine learning strategy right now, you should probably start to think about having one. It's very important. And I'm not saying go out and find a problem to go use this hammer on. Like, when it makes sense, you should be implementing it. But the reason that it's so important isn't just for labor savings or saving money. That's a very small piece of it. The things that AI and machine learning is going to do in the next few years is enable people to open up new markets. And that's what we were sort of talking about, like enabling people at the high school level to get highlights out of their content. People at every level are making video content. Hundreds of hours are uploaded every single minute to YouTube. And making sense of that is just an intractable problem for humans. But there is interesting stuff in there that can help you open up new markets and add to the bottom line of your company if you're smart about the ways that you attack these problems. So it's important not just for cost savings, but for opening new markets in video.
Now, David, we talked a little bit about finding things within raw video content.
Yeah.
But what really, when you start talking to a customer, what do you talk about?
Yeah, I think from a business standpoint, I would argue that aspect is one half of the equation. I would argue that the two main drivers that I think every company and every decision maker needs to think about are really unlocking dark metadata that hasn't been applied or hasn't been generated yet or hasn't been thought of yet, for one, but also then optimizing the workflow from top to bottom, all the way from signal acquisition through play out, as Jason's been talking about as well. When we talk about metadata generation, as I mentioned earlier, to get to Colin's point, the idea is that you could actually then identify certain aspects of videos that maybe you could turn into a monetization opportunity or into some sort of an advertising opportunity. If you could identify logos, for example, in a video programmatically and be able to either digitally insert other logos instead of that logo, or be able to do a report of this is how many times this logo appeared within the context of a goal being scored. within a soccer match, for example. Like that's really unique and valuable metadata that perhaps didn't exist in the past. So you're creating a new opportunity for that content rights owner to leverage that machine learning in new ways. That's
Right.
the idea.
Now, so obviously there's a number of tools you can use in the video AI space. We happen to have a couple of people from the platform companies here, but realistically, when you're talking about the deep, dark metadata, one of the things you're talking about is the ability to go through a piece of video content and find what?
Oh, content that no human had written a piece of metadata for, or a metadata structure didn't exist to
Okay.
house that metadata, or it's something new that's been identified since that video was created that doesn't exist within a system in some capacity. So that's the dark aspect of it. Like it
Okay.
literally didn't exist because no one applied it.
Right. And even the dark, so what would an example of that be? Aside from the ability to go through, get a full text metadata of the video,
Yeah.
get an identification of where each image is within the video content, being able to actually go and click on a link and say, this is where the cat is. I know the cats don't play tennis.
Well, no, there's a great example. He's not a cat, but he's a famous rapper, Common.
Okay.
We worked with the Grammy Awards recently to ingest all of the Getty images that were being produced on the red carpet. And then we were doing facial recognition to identify each celebrity. And if you wanted to find every photograph of Common and his awesome purple velvet jacket and his big purple bow tie, like you could find that, but we also applied sort of structural video algorithms to it as well, so that you could find other people who were wearing lavish purple velvet jackets, and there were others, or big giant bow ties, or
Okay.
whatever it was. So no human was sitting there typing in, this is Common, this is a big giant purple bow tie.
Right.
But Watson was able to identify that and create that metadata.
And doing that live.
And doing it live in real time as it was
In
as it
real
was being
time,
uploaded.
okay.
Yeah,
All right.
which was pretty cool.
That is pretty cool. Now,
If
one
you
of-
like Common.
Okay.
Or bow ties.
I think Matt had a couple of thoughts that were also on the business side of things. I want to let you get some words in.
Yeah, I mean, first I want to react to what you say. I think that ability.
You're a big Common fan?
Yeah, I'm a common friend, and I like all kind of music, but also this ability to label video, like frame per frame, and label the individual elements, but also the whole scene, is something that can be used a lot to improve the user experience, the consumer experience. And for example, there's this idea of content augmentation, which for me is very interesting. A few years ago now, we did some experimentation with custom YouTube implementation, where you could actually push on the timeline a specific piece of content that will augment actually the video. So for example, if the video was talking about a specific location, we will be able to push a little icon that will redirect you to Google Maps or Street View to see the location. Let's say the use case of Common, you could, for example, maybe push like a Google Play track from Common, or maybe like a biography about Common, or maybe his Twitter feeds. So that ability to augment the video content with other types of content is kind of mimicking the second screen behaviors in a way, where people will look for something as they're watching that content. Now you can do that automatically, and so you can improve the consumer experience. You can also monetize it, because what you're pushing might be ads, or it might be things you sell, it might be things you refer to.
Right.
But ultimately, that idea that you can improve the consumer experience is very important for me, because it means that you're going to have more loyalty and you're going to have more people coming to your platform. Beyond augmentation, for me, another example is this idea of just content recommendation in general. I always say, for me, one of the best use of AI with content is actually Spotify. I'm a big fan of Spotify. This is not a Google company. I've been using Spotify for, I think, more than 8 years now. I use it in Europe, even before it was released in the US. And obviously, Spotify knows a lot about my music habits, my music consumption, and they're able, every week to send that playlist called Discovery. How many people use Spotify in the room? Quite a lot. So every week, they send you, a very custom playlist called Discovery, which is based on your own preferences. And I'm sure most people in that room, like me, we have very complex preferences. It's not just common. It's not just one type of music like hip hop. Well, that playlist is really good because it's able to understand that complexity and give me content I don't know about, but I love. That is a huge competitive advantage, because it means that if tomorrow I were to leave Spotify to go to Apple Music, I would lose that personalization. I would lose that quality of recommendation. And so that is pretty much a barrier of entry for competitors versus Spotify. For me, that's one of the big advantages of AI here also. If you use a video platform, the more you use it, the less you're likely to leave it because they'll know very well what you like and they will give you that super granular level of recommendation you don't have anywhere else.
Yeah, and they've had ups and downs at Netflix with their implementation of the recommendation engine, but they made the most press in the earliest days, having the $1 million challenge, coming up with better algorithms for recommendation. And it fits really naturally with their strategy to get you to not get up in front of your TV, to binge for hours and hours on end. And you can see it at play. You just finish binging 6 episodes of something, and more often than not, the thing it recommends to watch next is something else that's going to get you to sit there for another 6 hours. So on the video side, there's definitely a big play for it. And Limelight, it's not as well known as its CDN offerings, but Limelight has a video content management offering called the Limelight Video Platform. And one of the more frequent, I wouldn't call it complaints, but time drains for customers of any system like that offers video CMS functionality is putting metadata in for every piece of content you uploaded, figuring out what the optimal thumbnail is, maybe looking at the engagement report to figure out where peak engagement is and where engagement drops off, and clipping off the parts that no one's watching. And all of those things, I think, you all spoke about them already, but getting rid of a lot of the labor-intensive parts of making your video libraries available online would serve the industry very well, because I think there's a lot of sort of mid-tier content that either doesn't get the engagement it deserves because it's not properly edited, or is not findable, it's not discoverable because it doesn't have the appropriate metadata.
Just to jump on Netflix, I think is a very interesting example because they use AI in different parts of the video flow, and they use it for recommendation. They use it for asset creation, which I think is really interesting. Like they're testing many different thumbnails. They even have created their own fonts so that they can actually now create thumbnails that always look good with the Netflix fonts. But then they're also using data science to identify which show to produce. Right. And that's why now you see more and more of like Netflix shows. They are, I don't know if we can always call them machine learning, it's definitely data science, but they're extracting patterns, preferences, and this is informing now, which scenarios, which shows they are going to create. And for me, that's fascinating how they have created that whole loop, which explains a lot of the success, I think.
Yeah, I think I saw a parody of that. I don't remember what it was. I'm not going to do it justice, but it was just a mashup of popular things. It's like Netflix now shows, The Rock sushi cooking show at home, with hip hop DJ
already.
music in the background or something.
Yeah, I know you're just making that up, but I would watch that show.
That's the point.
Binged it.
Yep.
I would binge that show.
Yeah.
Now, one of the, in fact, we also talked a little bit about best practices. So obviously you don't want to have a system create something where you're only going to have the best things that aren't relevant to somebody. What is a best practice? So when you are looking, and you're each in a different area, we like to talk about metadata just because it's a very important aspect of AI. It's really, in some ways, for the video content itself, is how you're going to ever find something or promote it. But when you're talking about best practices, what are some of the things that you think about in your organizations that you've actually identified over the time that you've been developing this?
I'll take some of that. The as we've gone after a lot of the projects where we applied techniques with large data sets, you tend to see some of the kind of similar impediments. And one is that data quality on the front end is often a challenge. It's a common misconception that you can just take a mess of data and throw it at an AI engine and magic will show out the other side, and that's just not true. So we find that a lot of times, making sure that you're clear about, what's in your data sets that you're going to be using to train, what are the semantics of the different attributes and the properties that you're gonna feed into the model development is really important. Being very crisp in, what do you want out of this thing? Do you want a classifier with keywords? Do you want, You know, do you want rankings? Do you want comparative outputs? Understanding what are the signals of value that you're trying to train for, and then how those relate to the attributes of your data sets. And then making sure that you're throughout that stack that you're driving for, clarity and definition, and don't just assume that it's mess in one side, magic out the other.
Really? No magic? What
There's a
about the
lot-
confidence?
There's a lot of stirring.
It
that
is
goes
There's
on.
a
it is
stirring,
pretty amazing, but
And the confidence score, isn't that right?
yeah.
Okay, so we're 99% confident that you guys have more best practices. Who wants to talk next?
I'm going to add to that and say that I think any strategy also has to include a data strategy, how you are training that algorithm, how you are helping it to understand what it is you want out of it.
Okay.
I think my colleague over here is completely right. You need to know exactly what it is you're going to get out of it, but you need to know how you're going to get there as well. And I think that also includes metadata flexibility. If you don't have a flexible metadata structure or someone on your team that understands how to build flexible, relational, either hierarchical or relative metadata structures, it's going to be difficult for you to manage that on an ongoing basis. I think you have to have a training strategy going in.
Now, is metadata something that, is there metadata as a service?
Well, that's a great question. Companies like IBM might be building a metadata
As a service, okay.
Solution that you might be seeing in the near future. But look, there are other companies that do this already, of
Okay.
course. And they do it in a variety of different verticals. It's typically done at the vertical level. You can find healthcare metadata companies. You can find financial services metadata companies. It doesn't really exist for M&E in a completely structured way because
Right.
everyone is a little bit different, sports versus movies versus what have you. But
Okay.
you could certainly use some existing products to build a metadata service.
Okay, so now you're not all snowflakes, but, sorry, what were you going to say?
I was just going to say one of the things. So there's sort of this push and pull between the business and the technical side, right? So on the business side, you want to constantly listening to your customers, asking what they want, implementing those things. But that has an effect on the technical side that you have to account for. So for example, we had a hockey customer that said, "Hey, can you pull out all of the face-offs?" And we said, "Yeah, sure." So we taught a classifier how to understand just from the video, no metadata at all, when a face-off was occurring and clip those out. But then that's one of those things when you go and you change the model, it starts to do other things into the neural networks and into your total package that you have to worry about from a technical standpoint. For us, we ran into things like overfitting of the model. So now it was keying in, it had seen many thousands of different games, but scoreboards, now that we've implemented this new module, it started to hone in only on the kind of scoreboards that it knew and became inflexible and rigid. So when you're creating your AI strategy and using the best practices and things like that, just understand the push and the pull between the product requirements and the business side stuff with what it's going to do on the technical side and how it's going to affect your product in the long run.
I want to add one thing to that. That overfitting problem is an incredibly common first result when you're going through some of these exercises. And a lot of that is related to the selection of your training data set relative to your output. If what you're after is looking for scoreboards and you train a bunch of pictures, they have variety, but the scoreboards are always prominent, then when you start throwing real images where maybe the scoreboard is a little more off to the side or at different angles, you might find that you have overfit to a very clean scoreboard classifier. So as you're understanding, what you want to get out of it, make sure that you're throwing the right data set into it to make sure that you get the variety that you want it to be able to handle.
Yeah, and after you've selected the data that you want to train it with, there are also best practices for how to train your algorithm. Like, for example, using a random subset of the training data instead of all of the training data, or using 5 random overlapping subsets of the data to train it, and then test it against some other set of data that it's never seen. So there are best practices that a lot of the workbenches that are out there, point-and-click workbenches, there's quite a few, like from R, MATLAB, others. A lot of them will guide you through that and say, I know you have 1 million data points. Don't train me on all of them. Let's do 15 iterations of 10,000 data points each, see what we come up with, and then let's go see how it works against 100,000 data points I've never seen before.
I think even before picking your data, and I agree with all points, but before picking your data and even starting to work on the algorithm from a design standpoint, one best practice we recommend is first, of course, start with what's your problem. many people they want to use AI without having a clearly defined problem, challenge, and that's an issue we see a lot. So starting with clearly understanding what you're trying to solve for, and then also try to understand if actually AI, machine learning is the right solution for this. And sometimes this is just overkill. You don't need AI for that. And I'll give you one example. I'm sure a lot of you use Gmail, and when you send an email on Gmail, you say attached, like this document attached, and you forget to attach it, you get that little notification asking you if you forgot to attach a document on purpose. Well, this is not using AI. This is using just like simple, hard-coded, technology. And we could have used AI, but we thought that it was just not needed for the benefits. And so that's something we see a lot. Is I work mostly with brands, and them wanted to use AI also for the sake of it, without knowing why. And there's a lot of hype around it. So we always try to first tell them, okay, what are you trying to solve? Do you really have a problem well defined? And actually, maybe you can solve that with much less efforts without needing to have like a whole data strategy and specific machine learning algorithms.
So a few years ago, one of our customers, a number of our customers provide us with detailed video QoE data, quality of experience, so statistics like rebuffers. And this customer is providing very detailed QoE data to us with the aim of allowing us to improve our quality from whatever we learned from there. Because if we improve our quality, they improve their quality, they improve their customer sat, they make more money. And we were trying to find patterns, like what causes a rebuffer? Who here is sure they know what causes a rebuffer? It's a tough question. It depends, right? And especially when you have metrics that are very non-noisy, I would say. Metrics like a percentage of sessions affected by rebuffers. It's binary. From a given user's point of view, either they experienced rebuffers or they didn't. And the only way for that metric to be a 0 is to have no rebuffers whatsoever. The rebuffer can happen anywhere within a 90-minute viewing session. So you're getting back these data points that said, you get a 2 p.m. data point that said, I had 100,000 sessions and 7 of them rebuffered. You don't know when they started. You don't know when they ended. It could have been a 30-minute viewing session, 60-minute viewing session. The person giving you the data doesn't know off the top of their head if it's prorated to the end. So when you get the data point, it means the rebuffer happened in the hour or two before, or what. So you get data that, in theory, should not be very noisy, but because of how it's being supplied, and it's being supplied by a third party, it ends up being noisy. So going back to the best practice that I completely agree with, know what problem you're trying to solve for. We said we're trying to find a single, not all, a single metric that has a high correlation coefficient to rebuffers, a single one. It doesn't have to be the only cause, and it doesn't have to be the biggest cause. But let's just find one and see if this data has statistical significance and helps us be better. And there were proposals to use machine learning to try to find this. In the end, do you know what won? I was bored and frustrated one night, and I was in Excel, and I did a 60-minute running average of the data, and I did time shifts back and forward in 30-minute intervals against 2 or 3 data points that I had a hunch might correlate closely to rebuffers, including one that we call hit first byte response time. So how many milliseconds does it take for the server to actually serve the data? You might think of it as server think time. And found a correlation, a very strong correlation on our older spindle-based machines. We don't have any more now. We're 100% SSD. This is an old anecdote. But we found that when that metric exceeded 5 milliseconds, rebuffers occurred with about a 10 times greater probability. Or the probability of sessions affected by rebuffers increasing went up significantly.
So
that was all done in Excel without any machine learning, munging the data and using intuition, old school. Had we gone down the ML path, we probably would have ingested a ton of data into Hadoop, run a whole bunch of algorithms against it, found 25 metrics that had some correlation, and probably not come to the conclusion we had, which is we need to get all the spindles out of our network.
So really the organization of the data, figuring out the best use case, figuring out what problem you're solving, the flexible workflow, and also making sure that that it's the appropriate thing to do. Now, all of these...
And intuition, because there's algorithms out there that will help you classify and categorize your data and try to help you figure out which data points are relevant.
Sure.
But they're very hard to put into practice. And sometimes there's nothing better than architects saying, these are the ones that I think we should start with.
And this is going to bring me to the next question. So realistically, we've got an audience full of people here. When they want to get started with AI, what are some of the things that they can do? So anybody here on the panel so David, you look like you're about to jump.
Yeah, because I'm glad you went there, because I think that's an important question. I mean, it gets back to the best practices a little bit, because it's not just about defining what your problem is, but literally who is going to help you get there. And this sounds like a sales pitch, I know, but I promise it's not.
Sales pitch, but you're not going to, right?
I'm not going to. I encourage all of you to think really hard about how you want to tackle that specific problem once you identify it. And I suspect that in many cases the answer isn't, I'm going to hire 2 Python developers, point them to GitHub, and download a bunch of open source, buckets of code, and then I'm just going to turn them loose, and all of a sudden, voila, I'm done. Like I think you need to have a better resourcing, staffing, best practices driven plan than that, because I've literally heard of potential clients who want to do exactly that. We're just going to do it ourselves, hire a bunch of Python engineers, and we're done.
Okay, so what about the planning side of this? Now, in fact, I think that when you start to think about planning, you obviously often look at the technology, but what are the other areas that you have to think about? Jason.
I'm Jason.
You're Jason and Josh and Jason.
Well, I do have one very quick thing to say, which is keep
Okay.
it simple.
Yes.
If you could just put up my image real quick,
Sure,
and then we'll
absolutely.
nuke it.
So-
But I would say keep it simple. Remember what I said our goal was early on. Our goal was simply to do more with less and improve quality at the same time. So really simple, right? Reduce costs and improve performance.
Okay.
And with what we implemented, every colored line is a different type of server in our IAD POP. Like I described earlier, different ages, different quality levels, different performance. And ideally, you want those lines to merge so you can't see any difference between them. We went from a world where servers were often doing 2 times what they should be doing in terms of traffic, which doesn't mean they were catching on fire. It just meant rebuffers were more likely. This is over a year old.
What questions should you ask your service providers then about using AI? So because people here in the room have obviously a number of people that they're working with, and you want to make sure that they get the kind of results that you're finding, what should they ask their providers?
One of the questions we get asked a lot is, because a lot of people are making claims throughout the ecosystem, making claims of using AI in various capacities. So, always, peel the onion on that a little bit. Say, show me a result that this has delivered with your service, whatever it is. And we do that with our vendors. We get asked that. I'm sure everybody else up here sees that. So, ask for the specific result, and that was a great one that was just up on the screen. But you should be able to see some measurable output metric that moved from not so good A to much better B because if they're applying AI in that scenario because of the applied AI or whatever other techniques they're using.
Sorry, go ahead.
I was going to change back to the other topic.
No, but I think this is also important too. It's a lot of build versus buy, right? Is your company one? Now, I'm completely biased, but I think, as I mentioned earlier, most companies should have an AI strategy, but it's just not tenable for a lot of different organizations. So is your company one that wants to build versus buy? There's a lot of great solutions out there, and if AI can help with one of those, it's probably going to be cheaper to use an existing provider. Now, if you're trying to do something and you've identified AI as a solution, a potential solution, and that doesn't exist elsewhere in the ecosystem, well, you might have just spawned a new business unit and might be able to spin that off and start to do some licensing of your own. But it's a really interesting question, but you have to be smart about this as you would be with any other business case. You don't just say, okay, I'm going to hire a huge AI staff because that's the thing to do with no real strategy on how you're going to implement them.
Exactly.
Actually, my comment actually follows really nicely after yours. I wanted to make to me, the accessibility of AI tooling, stacks, capability, top to bottom, has been remarkably accelerating just over the last few years. I mean, the toolkits and services and stacks, depending on how much you want to buy, how much you want to build, how much you want to interact with them, have become incredibly accessible. There's great work by IBM, by Google, by Facebook, by Amazon, by many others more application-specific tools and companies as well. But you can now, through any number of services, submit, audio recording, video to get tagging. You can do all these kinds of classification use cases really, really conveniently. So it's worth trying. I mean, things you can try today very effectively to kind of get a sample of what's possible. You couldn't even touch 5 years ago without a team of PhDs and things like that. So do look for opportunities to reach out, give it a shot, engage one of the teams or tools that have the services, and see what they can do.
And in other words, don't reinvent the wheel pretty much, because AI is tough, takes a lot of resources, takes a lot of data, and I think that's what we're all saying is, if you want to start using AI, machine learning to optimize your video, to classify your video, you'd rather start first by using the plug-and-play solutions out there, the APIs out there, from all the different companies we mentioned. And if you really want to invest into your own team, you need to have the data, you need to have the tenants. This is very tough. And yeah, if you do that, that's great for the future, but you probably want to start first to understand how you're going to use the technology and the discipline by using these plug-and-play solutions, because the cost of entry is going to be much lower, and you're going to start to understand, and then kind of build yourself principles and certain kind of approach that then you can extend.
Exactly.
That's something we haven't talked at all, which I think is also interesting, is content creation. I mean, we're talking about video and AI, and for me, that's something that is still in the early days, but which I think is also exciting, is how we're going to be able to actually generate at scale video content by using AI. Have you ever heard, guys, about something called style transfer? Sounds like no, right? One of the very first kind of very hype use of AI was showing how you could take a very famous painting like Van Gogh and apply the style of Van Gogh to any other pictures. That's called style transfer. It's pretty much extract the patterns of the strokes of Van Gogh, and then you can apply that to any other picture. Does apply to images. Now this is something quite common. Well, this idea that you can extract patterns and content patterns and then reapply it to something else, frame per frame, is something that is coming to video. We've seen actually some kind of disturbing use cases with something called fake AI with video, where you can splash someone's face on someone else. And it's also sometimes interesting how you're going to be able to create hundreds of thousands of versions of the same video with slightly different elements, that will cater to different audiences. Be able to change maybe the landscape behind, be able to change some of the characters, maybe be able to change the voice in the content in order to match specific audiences or specific use cases. So in that case, I don't think there are existing plug-and-play solutions yet. But for me, that's something where we are going, which is this ability to literally generate video content from scratch. And I'm not just saying animation, I'm saying even real hyper-realistic video, just by almost giving it a bunch of guidelines. We see that with pictures already. You can generate pictures from scratch just by saying, I want you to create an image with a flower and a hummingbird. And it will create from scratch an image that didn't exist before just by using thousands of previous images of flowers and hummingbirds and generate that. So think how you will be able to apply that to video. And for me, that's quite fascinating. I think we're in the early days, but that idea that you're going to be able to generate video content from scratch opens a lot of interesting possibilities in terms of creativity, but also in terms of business.
Now,
Aren't you also, though, creating a huge market for adversarial networks to identify when a piece of content's been generated by an AI as opposed to an actual camera? Or does that become part of the equation as well? I'm just curious about Google's stance on that.
I mean, I don't have any official stance on that, but I'd say that it opens also a lot of questions in terms of where content is coming from and what content we can
Yeah.
That's going to lead me to, we have 10 minutes left, and I wanted to make sure that we can take questions if there are any from the
Based on
audience.
that,
This might be the last live
So-
real panel
and-
that was generated in
And
4 or 5
the gentleman behind the Deloitte.
To your previous point about the ability to interpret video and things like that, one of the things I think a lot of people are dealing with now is the closed captioning issues.
Yes.
And I have limited budget, and I have to provide this to it. How soon do you think that might actually be something where you can scan it into an AI and pop it out? Because obviously we have a lot of issues with compatibility, variability, unless you manually have someone type it. I have to run a 6-hour board meeting. I don't want to. It's really hard to type and things like that. So
Well, there are existing technologies. I mean, I would talk just for Google here, but there's an API called the Speech API that pretty much is able to capture, if you feed it with sound, it will be able to extract, turn the voice into text. So that's pretty much closed captioning. Even going beyond then, there's another API doing natural language processing. So you could also, not only you could closed caption your video, but then you could extract meaning from it. So it means that you could not only have closed captioning, but then also maybe at the end of your meeting have a summary of the meeting, or maybe automatically extract the action items. So the certainty is not 100%, especially in a meeting where maybe people talk one over the others, or there's noise, etc. But there are already solutions, and I'm pretty much sure that IBM also has similar solutions.
Which is a great segue into, we actually launched a closed captioning product last month for the M&E broadcast business. Obviously, there is some training component of that, especially if you're talking about like local news broadcast, for example, like understanding like the landmarks in Washington, D.C. versus New Orleans versus London versus what have you. So there's certainly a training component of that, but we actually have a market offering right now that can generate either closed captioning with appropriate breaks for either broadcast workflows, or we can actually spit it out into web VTT files as well.
And you can add translation to that, obviously,
Yep.
which is also interesting, this ability to, it's a real-time meeting or real-time event, and have like that great closed caption that is translated to a multiple market is also something very powerful.
And keyword extraction too, right? So you can actually take that text, extrapolate some keywords and topics out of it, and turn that into metadata too.
Mm-hmm.
The last session of the AI track today will be actually comparing some of the different platforms, and we'll be talking about the features and benefits that they have. So if you're interested in that. Hey, Daniel.
So we've talked a lot about how to get started, problems that you have to solve, but somebody's always got to get involved at some point, whether it's a spot check or further training. Can you talk a little bit about sort of the care and feeding of your machine learning here, so that you're not suddenly solving a problem that's now morphed into something else?
We take two approaches to that. One is we develop tools that sit alongside the algorithm so that you can see what is being generated and actually make edits to it. And so you can assign, either internal staffers or ask us to help you to do that. An example is for closed captioning, we've got an inline editing tool that allows you to see what is being generated. You can actually do the editing in real time, in the tool, and then that gets fed back into the algorithm so it understands it better. So it's a combination of having people available to do that spot check and the right tools to sort of fall into that, based on what it is you're using it for, closed caption being an example.
And our care and feeding, you actually just saw in the screenshot I shared. That is a system that our operations team uses on a regular basis. It's a human process. But the idea is, in that point of presence that you saw, we have 6 completely different servers with completely different capabilities. As long as those lines stay so close together that you can't make out the individual colors, then we've done our job, because we're targeting exactly the right amount of content, exactly the right amount of traffic to all of these different servers to keep them running at exactly the same bottleneck utilization, whether it's CPU, disk, or NIC, at all times. And so as soon as you can start to make out runaway lines, we investigate. Maybe a new capacity class was introduced that we didn't know about, a different model of Xeon CPU that we don't have ML data for yet. Maybe someone changed some BIOS settings. So that UI that I showed you is our feedback loop.
But you
So-
still, you need humans.
You absolutely need humans. This is not going to be running by itself anytime soon. We have another question here, and I know that we've talked a little bit about the human question, but I want to get the audience's response.
So I'm cheating because I have my own preconceived notion about what I want here as the answer.
Okay.
Yes.
How do we know when we're going too far? There's no question that we can collect data, but
Right.
when are we just doing it for our own detective or joy? And when are we somehow doing it pointlessly?
So how do we know we are going too far?
When you're no longer tying these data insights into actionable items. If you're not tying it to revenue, if you're not tying it to something that you can do to provide your customers with more value, then what's the point? More data doesn't really help without better insights.
Yeah, we talked a little bit about earlier, is you define with what purpose, what question do you want to answer, what value indicator do you want to get out of it? And if you're just creating data or seeing what indicators might come out, you're into, what'd you say, geektacular
Geektacular.
data exploration. So.
Yeah, the good news is that, that money sort of drives behavior, and it's really hard to get budget for an initiative that doesn't have an ROI.
You know, I will actually just cut in, just for one thing, my favorite part about AI, and this is actually for the video production people that are here, is being able to categorize all your content. You have probably hard drives, clouds, everything, where you're sticking a lot of video content. Having you have the ability to see where your content is, where 3 years worth of content, if that's important to your organization, where the content is and how you can go and find it and reuse it without actually having to spend 6 weeks going and looking for that file is to me a pretty important part of, and this isn't on the delivery, but this is on the actually just finding it within your video files. Are there any other questions that we have in the audience?
Yeah, so this is, it's a question about resource optimization.
Sure.
So network operators have all sorts of resources, whether they're caching or transport or compute or whatever.
Mm-hmm.
How far away are we from a time when networks can reoptimize themselves based on unpredicted traffic?
How far are we from a time when networks can, now we know that this question was just meant for you, but how far are we away from when a network can optimize itself?
Any VCs in the room? Anyone want to go start a company? It depends. It depends on the answer to that question. And you know, what are you guys doing later? I'm pointing to some people I know in the back. How far away are we? I am seeing a surprisingly small amount of talk online about machine learning for operations, machine learning for network operators, auto-tuning and auto-healing using these algorithms. I'm seeing a surprisingly small amount. My belief is that we are currently at the phase where, you know, Google and Facebook and maybe Netflix are doing it. They're probably doing it really well, and it's just not something they're ready to talk about publicly. And other big sophisticated companies are doing it internally. And what has happened with many, many other technologies is at some point the people with that experience leave. They say, what cool startup should we create? So my guesstimate is probably 5 to 8 years, and we'll start seeing companies that say, we have a technology to help you, you know, load balance your life. Where you plug in, you know, network hardware, servers, whatever, right? Total bet, 5 to 8 years. Yeah, I don't know what I get for being right or wrong, so it doesn't matter.
I don't
Okay,
know that
well, I like load balancing your life.
I don't know that I would put years on it, but we do a lot of work. We don't actually do content delivery. We do a lot of orchestration of delivery, and it's the similar kind of approaches where you are taking multiple feeds, trying to deal with increasingly chaotic real-world actions. You know, Apple ships a new patch to iOS, and Xbox has a bunch of new game updates. Those things all ripple through the world in a way that affects, to some extent, you know, a lot of the big public delivery clouds, networks, and exchange points. And you know, driving towards a more data-driven, aware, reactive, collective system, I think a lot of us are participating in. I wouldn't. I'd love it if it happened in 5 years. I think we've got a little more time to go.
I'm a betting man, so I have to answer that question with a total swag.
But that would mean that we retire in 5 years.
I unfortunately have to load balance the session. We're out of time. I want to thank you all for coming. I want to thank the speakers for being here. We have there's another track today after this, and there's going to be tracks all day long on AI and video. And I think that there's some fascinating things that are happening in the market. I think that if you have an interest where you haven't found these gentlemen have answered your questions, please reach out either to me or to them. If you want to look at some other of the AI articles that I've written on Streaming Media's website, just go in and search my name, and you'll find a number of the pieces that I've written over the year on content management, on video delivery, and a lot of the other pieces. So thank you very much for being here, and I hope you enjoy for the rest of the conference.